So hi, yeah, as you just heard, I'm Patrick Keeling. I'm the director of the Center for Microbial Diversity and Evolution, which is in the Faculty of Science. So I'd like to just give a few acknowledgements here. I'd like to first thank both the faculties of Art and Science and also the CMDE who have come together to co-sponsor this talk. And I'd also like to thank Professor Dawkins, who very kindly changed his travel plan so that he could be here, so that we could all hear him today. And so we are all very grateful for that as well. So I'm personally really pleased to be able to support an event like this because I'm an evolutionary biologist. And evolutionary biology is a target of a highly coordinated and currently well-funded opposition right now called intelligent design, but it goes back many years. Various branches of science are targets of strong opposition like this, but evolution's different in one important way at least. First of all, it poses no real or even imaginary physical threat to anything. I'll get to that. Other disciplines in science are actually strongly opposed, but in general, whether it's true or not, the opposition is based on some physical threat to our physical well-being. And this can be insurance scams or superbugs or famines or whatever you want. Evolution's different than these things because evolution is not a technology. Evolution is an idea. The physical, excuse me, there's no physical threat from Darwin's ideas, but there is a metaphysical threat, and to some people this is much, much, much worse. And so the organization of this opposition is accordingly stronger. In fact, I would go so far as to say that we can't find any really good analogy in contemporary opposition to other modern branches of science. If we want to find something useful, we have to go all the way back to the 16th century, which is the Copernican revolution of cosmology. So Copernicus's ideas really put us in our place in the universe, okay? And which is to say we're nowhere special. We were at the center of the universe, and when he was done with us, we're sort of, you know, wherever. So Darwin's ideas are similar, and the analogy's been made many times, including in The God Delusion by Professor Dawkins. But what I want to point out is that what Darwin did is he put us in our place in the tree of life, and it's also nowhere special. We're just a little twig on the end of animals, and I'm a protostologist, and I can tell you animals don't matter. So, but what's interesting is the reaction is very similar. Where we've come to accept Copernicus's ideas with no problem, the opposition to Darwin goes on, and it still has this kind of medieval air to it, I think. So what does any of this have to do with God? Of course, that's the subject today, and without God, there would be no reason to challenge evolution by natural selection because there is no serious challenge to the basic principles of evolution by natural selection that's derived from either reason or evidence. And that's the subject of today's talk, I think, is reason and evidence. Now, I want to make one more thing clear, and I'll try to be brief, and it's about Canada. We as Canadians, I think, are too fond of supposing that reason and evidence are only besieged to the south of the border, okay? But this is false. Don't get smug. This is not true. It's probably not as big a problem here, and it's probably not as public a problem here, but I think it is a problem, and it's one that we want to be quite watchful of, okay? So to illustrate this, last night I was at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and they have a Darwin exhibit on right now, which is excellent. And I was lucky enough to get to go after hours for a tour. Fantastic exhibit. One panel was a timeline of the social backlash against Darwin's ideas, okay? And one of the sort of prominent features of this was Arkansas's Balanced Treatment Act of 1981. This act obliged teachers in public schools to give equal time to evolution and creationism in science classes, okay? Now this is a preposterous law, don't get me wrong, and it deserves to be ridiculed, there's no question about it. But what struck me about it was very close to my own personal experience, okay? As a senior high school student, my biology class, the school board mandated equal time to creationism and evolution, okay? And now this was not in Arkansas, this was in Ontario. My teacher actually was a creationist, and he didn't give us the evolution side of the bargain, so we only got creationism. And this was 10 years after the Supreme Court of the United States overturned the Arkansas law that's much more famous. So I guess all I'm trying to say there is that I think it's time that we look inward. I think we need to look a little closer to home before we get complacent about this particular question. But anyway, You didn't come here to speak, or to hear me speak, I know that. Believe me, I'll just go on for half an hour about my own research now. So, without any other ado, I will introduce Professor Dawkins, and Professor Dawkins doesn't need a long biography or introduction. So I will just say that he's the Charles Simonyi Professor or Chair of Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford, and he's here today to discuss reason and evidence and the God delusion.
We shouldn't be complacent in Britain either, by the way, just the same problem coming. I'd like to thank Dean Lehman for organizing this lecture, and UBC obviously. Also, I must thank the Fraser Institute for flying me out and agreeing to this additional talk at UBC. And thanks too to the Centre for Inquiry, Canada. Isn't it a remarkable coincidence? Almost everybody has the same religion as their parents. And it always just happens to be the right religion. Religions run in families. If we'd been brought up in Greece, we'd all be worshipping Zeus and Apollo. If we'd been born Vikings, we'd be worshipping Wotan and Thor. How does this come about? Through childhood indoctrination. No wonder religion runs in families. One by one, those ancient belief systems have vanished from the face of the earth, and we seem to get on just fine without them. We're all atheists with respect to Zeus with his thunderbolts, Apollo, Wotan, Thor with his hammer, Baal, Mithras, Amun-Ra. All were once worshipped as gods. People believed in them, prayed to them, sacrificed to them. Children were brought up with them, told of their existence as a matter of undoubted fact. Nowadays, everybody agrees that no matter how sincere those believers undoubtedly were, they were deluded. Every one of those gods was a delusion, and so were countless gods that human tribes have sincerely believed in all around the world and throughout history. Some of us just go one god further. Now, my book is called The God Delusion, and I need to make it clear that the God I'm talking about as a delusion is a personal, intelligent, creative being like Yahweh, Allah, Baal, Wotan, Zeus, or Lord Krishna. If by God you mean nature, goodness, the universe, the laws of physics, the spirit of humanity, or Planck's constant, then we're going to be talking at cross purposes. An American student asked her professor whether he had a view about me. Sure, he replied, he's positive science is incompatible with religion, but he waxes ecstatic about nature and the universe. To me, that is religion. Well, if that's what you choose to mean by religion, well and good, that makes me a religious man. But if your God is a being who intelligently designs universes, listens to prayers, forgives sins, wreaks miracles, reads your thoughts, impregnates virgins, cares about your welfare and raises you from the dead, then you're unlikely to be satisfied. As the distinguished American physicist Steven Weinberg said, if you want to say that God is energy, then you can find God in a lump of coal. But I would add, don't expect congregations to flock to your church. The kind of religion that I have been talking about as not what I'm talking about is pantheistic religion. I could call it Einsteinian religion. And it's hard to see how anybody could disagree with it, and I certainly don't, except that I think it's confusing to use the word God in that sense, as Einstein did, and it's confusing because most people use it in a very different sense. When Einstein said, did God have a choice in creating the universe, he meant, could the universe have begun in more than one way? When Einstein said, God does not play dice, that was his poetic way of doubting Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. Einstein was very irritated when theists misunderstood him to mean a personal God. But what did he expect? The hunger to misunderstand should have been palpable to him. If you meet a religious physicist, the chances are he'll be religious only in the Einsteinian sense. Religious physicists are usually atheists of a poetic disposition. So am I. But given the widespread yearning for that great misunderstanding, deliberately to confuse Einsteinian pantheism with supernatural religion is an act of intellectual high treason. The Indian-American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Subramanian Chandrasekhar said, "This shuddering before the beautiful, this incredible fact that a discovery motivated by a search after the beautiful in mathematics should find its exact replica in nature, persuades me to say that beauty is that to which the human mind responds at its deepest and most profound." Or the American physicist John Wheeler, who just recently died, "We will grasp the central idea of it all as so simple, so beautiful, so compelling, that we will all say each to the other, 'Oh, how could it have been otherwise? How could we all have been so blind for so long?'" But with all this talk of aesthetic beauty, we mustn't forget that beauty isn't enough. It must also be true, and that comes back to evidence. Beauty may be a good guide to the stage of science where we put forward hypotheses, but those hypotheses must finally be tested. Carl Sagan said, "How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. Instead, they say, no, 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 my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way." A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. Einsteinian religion of that kind does not involve belief in anything supernatural. The pantheistic God doesn't exist, except in a purely poetic sense. Of those people who do believe in God as a supernatural intelligence, many make a distinction between deism and theism. The deistic God designs the laws of physics, then retires and is not interested any further in the affairs of the world or human affairs. The theistic interventionist God intervenes in human affairs, performs miracles, answers prayers, does all that other list of things that I mentioned earlier. Many of us call ourselves agnostics, but there is a great wide spectrum, a scale of agnosticism, which can lead to confusion. I put it out there as a scale from 1 to 7. 1 is a pure theist. I know there is a God. 7 is a pure atheist. I know there is no God. And 2 to 6 are various grades of agnosticism in the middle. For example, 4 in the middle is, I believe it's exactly 50% likely that there is a God. 2 is pretty much a theist. I think there's a very high probability of there being a God, but just thought of 100%. I'm a de facto theist. I don't know for certain. I strongly believe in God and live my life on the assumption that he's there. The other end, number 6, is very low probability of God existing, but just short of 0. I'm a de facto atheist. I can't know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that he's not there. And 3 and 5, you can imagine, are just interpolated there. I put myself in category 6 because I don't think it's scientifically reasonable to say, I know that there is no anything. I can't say, I'm absolutely positive there are no fairies. I just think it's rather unlikely, and if anybody wants to believe in fairies, the onus is on them. Bertrand Russell put it this way. He imagined that there might be a China teapot in orbit around the sun, somewhere between the orbits of Earth and Mars. And he pointed out that we can't actually disprove the existence of the teapot. We all have to be technically agnostic about the teapot, but in practice we are all a-teapotists. This 50-50 business, you laugh when I say 50-50 likelihood of there being God or not, but you'd be amazed at how often people will say, oh, well, you can't disprove God and you can't prove God. Therefore, God is exactly equally likely to exist as not to exist. Many, many people fall into that logical fallacy. I think it's pretty obvious why it's a logical fallacy. I regard the question of the existence or non-existence of God as a very interesting question and as a strictly scientific question. In this I differ from some of my colleagues who regard it as somehow sidelined and nothing to do with science. I think it's a scientific question because a universe with a God would be a completely different kind of universe from one without. And it would be a scientific difference. God could clinch the matter in his favor at any moment by staging a spectacular demonstration of his powers, which would satisfy the most exacting standards of science. Even the infamous Templeton Foundation recognized that God is a scientific hypothesis by funding double-blind trials to test whether remote prayer would speed the recovery of heart patients. It didn't, of course, although a control group, interestingly, who knew that they were being prayed for, tended to get worse. I'm trying to get a class action lawsuit against the Templeton Foundation. The only one of the traditional arguments for the existence for God that is widely used today is the argument from design, the famous watchmaker argument. It's very familiar, surely one of the most superficially plausible bad arguments ever discovered. And it's rediscovered by just about everybody until they're taught the logical fallacy and Darwin's brilliant alternative. In the familiar world of human artifacts, complicated things like watches that look designed are designed. To naive observers, it seems to follow that similarly complicated things in the natural world that look designed, things like eyes and hearts, must be designed too. It's not just a bad argument by analogy. There's a semblance of statistical reasoning here too. It's fallacious, but it carries a superficial illusion of plausibility. If you randomly scramble the fragments of an eye or a leg or a heart 1,000,000 times, you'd be very lucky to hit even one combination that could see or walk or pump. And that demonstrates that such devices could not have been put together by chance. And of course, no sensible scientist ever said they could, because natural selection is the very opposite of a chance process. But lamentably, the scientific education of most of our students omits all mention of Darwinism, and therefore the only alternative to chance that most people can imagine is design. The English astronomer Fred Hoyle dramatized it in his own famous misunderstanding of natural selection. He likened it to a hurricane blowing through a junkyard and having the luck to assemble a Boeing 747, completely missing the point, as I say, that natural selection is not a chance process. It's a highly non-random, cumulative process. Even before Darwin's time, the impotence of the argument from design should have been glaring, and it was to philosophers such as David Hume. How could it ever have been a good idea to postulate, in explanation for the existence of complex, improbable, statistically improbable things, a designer who would have to have been even more complex and improbable? The entire argument is an obvious logical non-starter, as Hume realized long before Darwin was born. What Hume didn't know was the supremely elegant alternative to both chance and design that Darwin was to give us. Natural selection, so stunningly powerful and elegant, it not only explains the whole of life, I think it also raises our consciousness, boosts our confidence in science's ability to explain everything else. Essentially, what's wrong with creationism or intelligent design, by the way, they're the same thing. Don't be fooled into thinking that intelligent design is not just plain old creationism. Essentially, what's wrong with it is that it's what the philosopher Daniel Dennett calls a skyhook. A skyhook is a great hand that comes out of the sky and starts manipulating things. It's something large, something powerful, and it does things. But the problem with it is that it requires an explanation in its own right. Skyhooks explain nothing. They're just conjured up out of nothing. The opposite of a skyhook, in Dennett's terminology, is a crane. Cranes really do explanatory work. Natural selection is the crane par excellence. It works because it's cumulative. It starts from simple beginnings, which are easy to understand, and it works up by gradual degrees, cumulatively, step by step, to the prodigious heights of complexity and statistical improbability that we see in the living world. Natural selection is not just an alternative to chance, it's the only ultimate alternative to chance that's ever been suggested. Design is a workable explanation for organized complexity, but only in the short term. It's a good explanation for cars and computers and planes, but it's not an ultimate explanation because the designers of the car, etc., require an explanation, and we know what that is. It's evolution by natural selection. If, as the molecular biologists Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel once playfully speculated, life on this planet was deliberately seeded by a payload of bacteria in the nose cone of a rocket from a distant planet, we still need an explanation for the intelligent aliens who dispatched the rocket. And if they were orbiting Betelgeuse, we still need an explanation for where they came from. And if they came from a seeding bacterial nose cone from Aldebaran, we have to explain where that came from. Finally, that regress has got to stop. It's got to stop by some kind of a crane, some kind of a theory that starts with simple beginnings and works up by gradual, explicable degrees, a ratcheting process of some kind. And natural selection is the best, possibly the only one we know. The logic of creationist or intelligent design arguments is always the same. Some natural phenomenon is too statistically improbable, too complex, too beautiful, too awe-inspiring to have come into existence by chance. Everybody agrees about that. Here's where we don't agree anymore. Design is the only alternative to chance that the author, in his poverty-stricken imagination, can conceive of. Therefore, design must have done it. Science's answer to this faulty logic is also always the same. Design is not the only alternative to chance. Natural selection is a better alternative. Notice what rotten logic it is, the logic of intelligent design. We have theory A and theory B. Theory A is supported by loads of evidence. Theory B is supported by no evidence at all. Indeed, no effort is even made to find any evidence for it. Now, here's the key step in the argument. I can't understand how theory A explains some particular phenomenon X. Therefore, theory B must be right. That's all there is to it. That is the sum total of the argument for so-called intelligent design. That is what they want to have equal time for in schools. I bet you don't know how the elbow joint of the lesser spotted weasel frog evolved. Well, no, I don't. I don't know much about weasel frogs. I've never actually seen one, and I don't know how its elbow joint evolved. You don't? Right, God did it. It's a failure of the imagination. I've called it the argument from personal incredulity. Going back to Fred Hoyle and the Boeing 747, Fred Hoyle rightly pointed out that a hurricane blowing through a junkyard would never assemble a Boeing 747. The idea of doing something so complicated by chance just isn't possible. But if you put it like that, then God is the ultimate 747. Because the very nature of a design argument, if you rely on the design argument, is that there is no explanation. You're not even trying to offer an explanation for where the designer came from. However, let's teach the controversy. Let's have equal time. Stork theory to be taught alongside pregnancy theory in Kansas schools. Is it pure wishful thinking to suggest that there is a new wave of reason sweeping across at least the Western world? One possibly encouraging sign is a spate of rather successful books which are selling very well. And perhaps even more significant is the backlog. I've counted no fewer than 23 fleas. I'll explain why they're called fleas in a moment. These have all been published since The God Delusion in 2006. The flea allusion is from W.B. Yeats, but was there ever dog that praised his fleas? I think there were 23 there. There one or two come along. They come in at a rate of about one a week, and I haven't had time to put this one or this one on the slide. That one's not a flea. That's a separate one, rather sweet. You haven't seen that cover, but that design with the sort of red starburst is the British, is on the British cover of the God Delusion. And the God Delusion itself, I'm happy to say, has sold more than 1.5 million copies. Now, I'm not trying this evening to teach facts, and I'm certainly not trying to indoctrinate. What I'm trying to do, among other things, is to raise consciousness. And we've met the phrase consciousness raising in the mouths of feminists. There's no law against using a phrase like the rights of man or one man, one vote. And some 40 or 50 years ago, we would have not noticed such a phrase, but now we've all had our consciousness raised by feminists. And we feel uncomfortable when we hear a phrase like one man, one vote. Even those who still use man in such a phrase do so with their consciousness raised. They may be taking a stand for traditional language. They may even be deliberately trying to rile feminists. But whichever side you're on that, you have had your consciousness raised. You notice. I want to raise all our consciousnesses about some unconscious assumptions we all make about religion. Begin with a little experiment. At Christmas time, a few years ago, the newspaper I take in Britain, The Independent, was looking for a seasonal picture for Christmas. And they found a heartwarmingly ecumenical one at a school nativity play. The three wise men were played by Shadbreet, a Sikh, Musharraf, a Muslim, and Adele, a Christian, all aged 4. Now, my guess is you find that picture rather sweet. How nice that 4-year-olds who belong to different religions should come together in a nativity play. Now, suppose it said this: Shadbreet, a socialist, Musharraf, a conservative, and Adele, a liberal, all aged 4. All aged 4. Shadbreet an atheist, Musharraf an agnostic, and Adele a secular humanist. All aged 4. You wouldn't talk about a 4-year-old postmodernist child, or a 4-year-old Keynesian, a 4-year-old monetarist. Yet, our entire society is entirely happy about speaking of a 4-year-old Catholic child, or a 4-year-old Protestant child, a 4-year-old Muslim child. Why have we been conned into accepting that while we would ridicule the idea of a postmodernist child or a Gramscian Marxist child, we would ridicule such an idea, yet we don't even notice when people talk about a Protestant child or a Muslim child or a Catholic child? There is no such thing as a Catholic child. There's only a child of Catholic parents. By the way, that picture is from Belfast, and what you see there is a so-called Catholic child being shepherded through a hail of abuse and missiles, attempting to go to school, and it could just as well have been the other way around, of course. There's no such thing as a Protestant child. There may be only a child of Protestant parents. There's no such thing as a Muslim child. I repeat these slogans over and over again. Too often, it can't be too often, not when you're in the business of consciousness raising. Please, please, when you hear anybody talking about a tiny Catholic child, Protestant child, any labeling of a child with opinions of its parents that the child couldn't possibly be old enough to hold for itself, protest. Don't let them get away with it. Behave like the feminists did when they raised our consciousness about sexist pronouns. Now, I like to think that this consciousness-raising exercise with respect to the labeling of children is having some effect. And in Britain, there's a comedian called Marcus Brigstock, and I'm going to play a 3-minute routine of his, which I rather enjoy. I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope you won't be upset by it. And right at the end, you'll see the point about the labeling of children. So this is Marcus Brigstock. I hope it will play. I hope the sound will come through now.
Hello. I'd like to start this week with a request, and this one goes out to the followers of the 3 Abrahamic religions, to the Muslims, Christians and Jews. It's just a little thing really, but do you think that when you've finished smashing up the world and blowing each other to bits and demanding special privileges while you do it, do you think maybe the rest of us could sort of have our planet back? I wouldn't ask, but the thing is, I'm starting to think there must be something written in the special books each of you so enjoy referring to that tells you it's all right to behave like precious, petulant, pugnacious pricks. Forgive the alliteration, but your persistent power-mad punch-ups are pissing me off. It's mainly the extremists, obviously, but not exclusively. It's a lot of mainstreamers as well. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, okay? Muslims. Listen up, my bearded and veily friends. Calm down, okay? Stop blowing stuff up. Not everything that's said about you is an attack on the Prophet Muhammad and Allah that needs to end in the infidel being destroyed. Have a cup of tea, put on a Cat Stevens record, sit down and chill out. I mean, seriously, what's wrong with a strongly worded letter to the Times? Christians, you and your churches don't get to be millionaires while other people have nothing at all. They're your bloody rules. Either stick to them or abandon the faith. And stop persecuting and killing people you judge to be immoral. Oh, and stop pretending you're celibate as a cover-up for being a gay or a nonce. Right, that's 2 ticked off. Jews. I know you're God's chosen people and the rest of us are just whatever. But when Israel behaves like a violent, psychopathic bully and someone mentions it, that doesn't make them anti-Semitic. And for the record, your troubled history is not a license to act with impunity now. So, when the letters come, and I'm guessing they will, I can guarantee that each one of those faiths will be utterly convinced that I've singled them out for special criticism.
Why did it have to be us? Islam is a peaceful faith. I don't see what's wrong with being Christian. We're a peaceful, loving faith.
How dare you after all we've been through? We Jews know how terrible violence can be.
You see, all of them will be convinced that they're the ones being picked on. The Abrahamic faiths are like Scousers. They're always convinced they're a bit harder than everyone else. Right, and why is it that all of these faiths claim to be peaceful when even the most fleeting glance at a history of warfare will tell you otherwise? The relationship between religion and warfare is very similar to the relationship between ant and deck. You could have one without the other, but I'm not sure anyone would see the point. I wouldn't actually like it, but it would at least be refreshing to hear one of them come out and say,
Oh, our faith's violent as you like. We'll have a scrap, us lot. We do. Honestly, our special book says fight, fight, kill, maim, fight, smash, destroy, fight, murder, kill, and fight. That's why I signed up, to be honest. I'm a bit naughty, know what I mean?
but no, all of them claim to be peaceful religions. Yeah, peaceful right up to the point where someone takes something they think is theirs, or says the wrong thing, or looks at them funny, then it's fighty, smashy, kicky, punchy all the way. I know this will upset a lot of people, and frankly, I don't care. I'm getting so sick of religious people screwing it up for the rest of us. Please don't kill us, seriously. As far as I'm concerned, this is the only chance we get. When we die, it's all over. There's no virgins and pearly gates waiting for us, no big beardy man saying...
Right, so how do you think that went then? Bit mixed? Killed a lot of people in my name, I see. Not really what I had in mind, actually. Tell you what, have another go as a worm.
While we're at it, I'm sick of religious people forcing their children to define themselves by their parents' faith. A 4-year-old is no more a Christian than he is a member of the Postal Workers Union.
We want a fair working wage, decent working conditions, and time allotted to see the new Transformers film,
said a spokesman.
Yet more consciousness-raising. You've all seen maps of the world which show with coloured shading what people believe in different places. In the blue area, they're Catholic. In the Protestant area, in the red area, they're Protestant. In the yellow area, Eastern Orthodox. Green area, Sunni, Muslim, etc. Just imagine if scientists worked like that. Take a scientific controversy like the controversy over what drove the dinosaurs extinct. Some people think it was a meteorite, some people think it was a comet, or it may have been a virus, plague, it may have been egg stealers, lots of different ideas. Suppose you saw a map of the world in which in the blue area they all believe it was a meteorite, in the red area it's a comet, in the orange area it's a virus plague, in the green area it's egg stealers, and so on. Just imagine if science worked like that. You'd think it was completely dotty. And yet we, all of us, perfectly happily accept the idea that if you're born in a certain part of the world, you will be of a certain religion. Another example. This is the Quarterly Review of Biology. It's a well-known journal of biology where people publish their results. And I've edited a spoof issue, a guest issue, on the particular question of did an asteroid kill the dinosaurs? The first paper in my guest issue is Iridium layer at KT boundary and potassium-argon dated crater in Yucatan indicate that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Perfectly respectable scientific paper. You'll never be surprised to see a paper like that in the Quarterly Review. My second paper. The President of the Royal Society has been vouchsafed a strong inner conviction that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. It has been privately revealed to Professor Huxtane that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Professor Haldley has been brought up to have total and unquestioning faith that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Professor Hawkins has promulgated an official dogma binding on all loyal Hawkinsians that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Professor Huxkins is personally offended by all strident, shrill, and polemical denials that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. Professor Hallock's derives deep personal comfort from his belief that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. The president of the National Academy of Sciences has issued a fatwa against all who deny that an asteroid killed the dinosaurs. I hope your consciousness is being raised. I hope you're getting a feel for how extraordinarily privileged religious opinion is in all sorts of ways, in being allowed to get away with things which in no other field would we treat with anything other than ridicule and mirth. For some reason, religion is regarded as immune to the ridicule that it surely deserves. I'm now going to switch gears and look at a couple of criticisms that the God delusion has encountered. And interestingly, some of the strongest criticisms come from atheists, who, although they don't believe themselves, believe in belief, as Dan Dennett puts it. They just love the idea that other people believe in God. I'm an atheist, but I wish to dissociate myself from your shrill, strident, intemperate, intolerant, ranting language. Actually, if you look at the language of the God delusion, it's rather less shrill or intemperate than we regularly take in our stride when listening to political commentators, for example, or theatre critics, art critics, book critics. Here are some samples of recent restaurant criticism from leading London newspapers. It is difficult, if not impossible, to imagine anyone conjuring up a restaurant, even in their sleep, where the food in its mediocrity comes so close to inedible. All things considered, quite the worst restaurant in London, maybe the world, serves horrendous food grudgingly in a room that is a museum to Italian waiters' taste, Kirker 1976. The worst meal I've ever eaten, not by a small margin, I mean the worst, the most unrelievedly awful. What looked like a sea mine in miniature was the most disgusting thing I put in my mouth since I ate earthworms at school. Insulting a restaurant might seem trivial compared to insulting God. But restaurateurs and chefs really exist. And they have feelings to be hurt. Whereas blasphemy, as the witty bumper sticker puts it, is a victimless crime. The English literary critic Terry Eagleton described the distinguished novelist Kingsley Amis as a racist, anti-Semitic bore, a drink-sodden, self-hating reviler of women, gays, and liberals. Well, that's strident and intolerant. The passage from the God delusion, which is most often quoted as strident or shrill, is the opening of chapter 2, which says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." Now, that, I admit, is sort of up there with Terry Eagleton on Kingsley Amis, but it's only one passage in rather a long book. And the point I'm making is that the remarks about restaurants, the remarks about Kingsley Amis, the remarks that you'll read in any political discussion or argument or art criticism or theatre criticism, it's all just par for the course. It's just that people notice when you use that kind of language about religion or about God, because we've all been brought up to believe that religion should be immune to the sort of critical language which is just normal in other forms of discourse. I actually like to think that that passage about the God of the Old Testament being the most unpleasant character in all fiction is quite funny in a sort of way. It's something to do with the incongruous mismatch between a subject that could have been stridently or vulgarly expressed. And the actual words, which are Latinate, pseudo-scholarly, words like filicidal, megalomaniacal. Anyway, that was my intention. Another bit of the book which perhaps has given offense to people is the bit about Catholics. You can tell it's Catholics because of that sort of typical Catholic kitsch, those Queen of Heaven pictures. Here's the passage from the book. It's about the hankering after polytheism which I discern in the Roman Catholic Church. Pope John Paul II created more saints than all his predecessors of the past several centuries put together, and he had a special affinity with the Virgin Mary. His polytheistic hankerings were dramatically demonstrated in 1981 when he suffered an assassination attempt in Rome and attributed his survival to intervention by Our Lady of Fatima. A maternal hand guided the bullet. One cannot help wondering why she didn't guide it to miss him altogether. Others might think the team of surgeons who operated on him for 6 hours deserved at least a share of the credit. But perhaps their hands too were maternally guided. The relevant point is that it wasn't just Our Lady who, in the Pope's opinion, guided the bullet, but specifically Our Lady of Fatima. Presumably Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Medjugorje, Our Lady of Akita, Our Lady of Zaitun, Our Lady of Garabandal, and Our Lady of Knock were busy on other errands at the time. Nevertheless, people do feel very strongly about their faith, and they feel very offended if you insult it. This picture, for some reason, always reminds me of this Monty Python. We've come to expect never to be offended. Religions have come to expect that they must not be offended. The late Douglas Adams, great hero, gave a wonderful speech in Cambridge, which I was privileged to hear shortly before his death, where he pinned down this extraordinary phenomenon, this extraordinary way in which the whole of our society privileges religion when it comes to respect and not giving offense. He said, religion has certain ideas at the heart of it, which we call sacred or holy or whatever. What it means is, here is an idea or a notion that you're not allowed to say anything bad about. You're just not. Why not? Because you're not. If somebody votes for a party that you don't agree with, you're free to argue about it as much as you like. Everybody will have an argument, but nobody feels aggrieved by it. If somebody thinks taxes should go up or down, you're free to have an argument about that. But on the other hand, if somebody says, I mustn't move a light switch on a Saturday, you say, I respect that. Why should it be that it's perfectly legitimate to support the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, Republicans or Democrats, this model of economics versus that, Macintosh instead of Windows, but to have an opinion about how the universe began, about who created the universe, no, that's holy. We are used to not challenging religious ideas, but it's very interesting how much of a furore Richard creates when he does it. Everybody gets absolutely frantic about it, because you're not allowed to say such things. Yet when you look at it rationally, there is no reason why those ideas shouldn't be as open to debate as any other, except that we have agreed somehow between us that they shouldn't be. I admit to being offended by certain things. I'm offended by chewing gum. I'm offended by backwards baseball hats. But I don't try to get a version of the blasphemy law passed to prevent people chewing gum or reversing their caps. So what if I am offended? What if my feelings are hurt? Does that give me the right to prevent others from expressing their opinions? Is there a time when it is actually right to be offended? Yes. We should be offended when children are denied a proper education, made to learn the Quran by heart instead. We should be offended when children are told they will spend eternity in hell. That, by the way, is from a Christian website specifically designed to scare children. We should be offended when medical science is compromised. We should be offended when voodoo is given equal weight to science. We should be offended by hymen reconstruction surgery. We should be offended by female circumcision, so-called, female genital mutilation. This picture was taken in Africa, but it happens in Britain. I had a conversation with a schools inspector from London who told me it's common. Girls are typically sent away to stay with an uncle in Bradford. We should be offended by stoning. This young Kurdish woman was stoned to death in a so-called honor killing because she wanted to marry a young man of the wrong religion. Atrocities are frequently committed in the name of religion, but that, of course, doesn't mean that a majority of religious people commit atrocities. Far from it. I wouldn't for one moment wish to be seen to be suggesting that. But the important thing is that it cannot be truthfully said, although unfortunately it often is, it cannot be truthfully said that atrocities are committed in the name of atheism. Stalin and Mao Zedong happened to be atheists, but the atrocities they committed were not committed in the name of atheism. The point is that there is no logical pathway leading from atheism to evil deeds, whereby a reasonable person, once they had accepted atheism, would be led by reason and logic to kill, to maim, to do horrible things. But there is a perfectly sensible logical path leading from religion to atrocity. Obviously not from all religion, it doesn't always lead that way, but it's possible to conceive of a logical path, because if you absolutely believe you're right, if you absolutely have total faith that it is your duty to your God to, say, kill infidels, stone adulterers, push walls over on homosexuals, you do these things in the absolute utter conviction that you are good and righteous to do so. The 19 hijackers on September the 11th, 2001 were, in a funny way, righteous, good people. They believed they were good. They sincerely thought they were doing the right thing according to the religion in which they'd been brought up, indoctrinated as children. I mentioned the novelist Kingsley Amis a moment ago. His son Martin Amis is an equally distinguished novelist. Here's something Martin Amis said, which is relevant to this point. He said, "Secularism contains no warrant for action." One can afford to be crude about this. When Islamists crash passenger planes into buildings or hack off the heads of hostages, they shout, "God is great." When secularists do that kind of thing, what do they shout? Obviously, that's a rhetorical question, inviting the answer. They don't do that sort of thing. However, look at what a critic of his book wrote. The question is meant to be rhetorical, but there's a simple answer. They shout, "Heil Hitler." I am utterly fed up with meeting that particular criticism. The argument is supposed to go, Hitler was an atheist. By the way, Hitler wasn't an atheist. Hitler was probably a Roman Catholic, but if not a Roman Catholic, some kind of odd believer in providence or some sort of sub-Wagnerian Nordic ravings. But that's not the point. The point is that even if Hitler was an atheist, so what? It was not his atheism that led him to do terrible things. Hitler was also a vegetarian. Now, it's sometimes said that humans need religion, even if it isn't true. They need the comfort of religion. Humanity's need for comfort is, of course, real. But isn't there something childish, something infantile, in the belief that the universe owes us comfort as of right? Isaac Asimov's remark about the infantilism of pseudoscience, things like astrology and things like that, is just as applicable to religion. He said, "Inspect every piece of pseudoscience, and you will find a security blanket, a thumb to suck, a skirt to hold." And by the way, it's astonishing how many people are unable to understand that X is comforting does not imply X is true. A related plaint concerns the need for a purpose in life. I quote one critic, actually from Canada. He said, "The atheists may be right about God, who knows, but God or no God, it's clear that something in the human soul requires a belief that life has a purpose that transcends the material plane." One would think that a more rational than thou empiricist such as Dawkins would recognize this unchanging aspect of human nature. Does Dawkins really think this world would be a more humane place if we all looked to the God delusion instead of the Bible for truth and comfort? Actually, yes. Since you mention humane, yes, I do. But I must repeat yet again, the consolation content of a belief does not raise its truth value. I can't deny the need for emotional comfort, and I can't claim that the worldview adopted in my book offers anything more than moderate comfort. If you're afraid of death, for example, you might superficially think that a priest who tells you you're not really going to die would be more comforting than a scientist who tells you it's highly implausible that our individuality could survive the decay of our brains. But I've heard experienced nurses in old people's homes say that the ones who are most terrified of death tend to be the Catholics. All that guilt fed them from the cradle up, the terror of purgatory and hell. As for eternal nothingness, is it really all that frightening? As Mark Twain said, "I do not fear death. I had been dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and had not suffered the slightest inconvenience from it." I want to end by reading the opening lines of a previous book of mine, Unweaving the Rainbow. These are lines that I have long earmarked to be read at my own funeral. "We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they're never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here in my place, but who will in fact never see the light of day, outnumber the sand grains of Sahara. Certainly, those unborn ghosts include greater poets than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. We know this because the set of possible people allowed by our DNA so massively outnumbers the set of actual people. In the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I, in our ordinariness, that are here. We privileged few who won the lottery of birth against all odds, how dare we whine at our inevitable return to that prior state from which the vast majority have never stirred? Thank you very much.
Opposed, but in general, whether it's true or not, the opposition is based on some physical threat to our physical well-being. And this can be insurance scams or superbugs or famines or whatever you want. Evolution's different than these things because evolution is not a technology. Evolution is an idea. The physical, excuse me, there's no physical threat from Darwin's ideas. But there is a metaphysical threat, and to some people this is much, much, much worse. And so the organization of this opposition is accordingly stronger. In fact, I would go so far as to say that we can't find any really good analogy in contemporary opposition to other modern branches of science. If we want to find something useful, we have to go all the way back to the 16th century, which is the Copernican revolution of cosmology. So Copernicus's ideas really put us in our place in the universe, okay? And which is to say, we're nowhere special. We were at the center of the universe, and when he was done with us, we're sort of, you know, wherever. So Darwin's ideas are similar, and the analogy's been made many times, including in The God Delusion by Professor Dawkins. But what I want to point out is that what Darwin did is he put us in our place in the tree of ours for a tour. fantastic exhibit. One panel was a timeline of the social backlash against Darwin's ideas. Okay? And one of the sort of prominent features of this was Arkansas's Balanced Treatment Act of 1981. This act obliged teachers in public schools to give equal time to evolution and creationism in science classes. Okay? Now, this is a preposterous law, don't get me wrong, and it deserves to be ridiculed. There's no question about it. But what struck me about it was very close to my own personal experience. Okay? As a senior high school student, my biology class, the school board mandated equal time to creationism and evolution. Okay? And now, this was not in Arkansas. This was in Ontario. My teacher actually was a creationist, and he didn't give us the evolution side of the bargain. So we only got creationism. And this was 10 years after the Supreme Court of the United States overturned the Arkansas law that's much more famous. So I guess all I'm trying to say there is that I think it's time that we look inward. I think we need to look a little closer to home before we get complacent about this particular question. But anyway, you didn't come here to speak, or to hear me speak, I know that. Life, and it's also nowhere special. We're just a little twig on the end of animals, and I'm a protostologist, and I can tell you animals don't matter. So, but what's interesting is the reaction is very similar. Where we've come to accept Copernicus's ideas with no problem, the opposition to Darwin goes on, and it still has this kind of medieval air to it, I think. So what does any of this have to do with God? Of course, that's the subject today, and without God, there would be no reason to challenge evolution by natural selection, because there is no serious challenge to the basic principles of evolution by natural selection that's derived from either reason or evidence. And that's the subject of today's talk, I think, is reason and evidence. Now, I want to make one more thing clear, and I'll try to be brief, and it's about Canada. We as Canadians, I think, are too fond of supposing that reason and evidence are only besieged to the south of the border, okay? But this is false. Don't get smug. This is not true. It's probably not as big a problem here, and it's probably not as public a problem here, but I think it is a problem, and it's one that we want to be quite watchful of, okay? So to illustrate this, last night I was at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and they have a Darwin exhibit on right now, which is excellent. And I was lucky enough to get to go after it. Believe me, I'll just go on for half an hour about my own research now. So, without any other ado, I will introduce Professor Dawkins, and Professor Dawkins doesn't need a long biography or introduction. So I will just say that he's the Charles Simonyi Professor or Chair of Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford, and he's here today to discuss reason and evidence and the God delusion.
We shouldn't be complacent in Britain either, by the way, just the same problem coming. I'd like to thank Dean Lehman for organizing this lecture, and UBC, obviously. Also, I must thank the Fraser Institute for flying me out and agreeing to this additional talk at UBC. And thanks too to the Centre for Inquiry, Canada. Isn't it a remarkable coincidence?
So hi, yeah, as you just heard, I'm Patrick Keeling. I'm the director of the Center for Microbial Diversity and Evolution, which is in the Faculty of Science. So I'd like to just give a few acknowledgements here. I'd like to first thank both the faculties of Art and Science and also the CMDE who have come together to co-sponsor this talk. And I'd also like to thank Professor Dawkins, who very kindly changed his travel plans so that he could be here so that we could all hear him today. And so we are all very grateful for that as well. So I'm personally really pleased to be able to support an event like this because I'm an evolutionary biologist. And evolutionary biology is a target of a highly coordinated and currently well-funded opposition right now called intelligent design, but it goes back many years. Various branches of science are targets of strong opposition like this, but evolution's different in one important way at least. First of all, it poses no real or even imaginary physical threat to anything. Other I'll get to that. Other disciplines in science are actually strongly